listening to the Big Blue Marble Podcast with Anwar Knight.
Well, hello there. So nice to be back with you. Truly, I enjoy our time together. Hope things are well. My name is Anwar Knight. This is the Big Blue Marble Podcast. If it's your first time, welcome. Welcome to this show that is growing. More and more listeners around the world, in fact. We appreciate your time and certainly your company. We have a really interesting show today. How the climate crisis is making us sick, and I think it's going to surprise you. So we'll unpack that in just a moment, but let's connect. How are things? It's busy now, isn't it? The holiday rush has begun for many, and on top of that, the Knight household has grown by 2. Yep. Bingo and Chelsea. They are fish that we have adopted. Is adopted the right term? I don't see why not. I mean, we got them from a pet shop. They are legally ours now. So we have adopted 2 fish. You know, my youngest boy turned 5 last week, and he's wanted some other fish. It started over the summer. We won a goldfish at a summer fair. It didn't do too well. But we promised him, if he's serious, we would look into it. So he has really made an effort that he wants to take care of some fish. We have a dog at the moment. So for his birthday, we got a small aquarium, and this comes with the filter. It's got a funky LED bubble light. So now Chelsea and Bingo are calling it home. No idea where they got the names. Him and his brother decided that's what we're going to call them. So we got bloodfin tetras, a very pretty fish, actually. And when we were getting them, all these things that you don't think about. I think it's just a fish. I got the aquarium. We need some food. We're good. The gentleman at the pet store, nice man. But, boy, he knows how to make a sale. You need to get bacteria drops, chlorine drops. Do you have a thermometer? I'm like, no, I don't have a thermometer. Why do I need a thermometer? You need a thermometer. It has to be in the green zone, the temperature. I'm like, okay, we're getting a thermometer. What about foliage? And I stopped at foliage. You need plants. So, okay, we're getting 2 plastic plants in this 1-gallon tank. That's our foliage. These fish are now living at the Hilton. I mean, they're doing well. And actually, if you look at them, they're actually very fascinating creatures. And I may now add them to my Reasons Why I Love Nature board that I have on the website. It's on the top link there. I'm compiling 101 Reasons Why I Love Nature. I have several entries already. You can help me, by the way. In fact, I would appreciate your help. And I know we all have our own special, aspect of nature, whether it's an element or it's a creature. Let me know, and we will consider it. We'll put it as a part of the official tally count, the board. The link's on our website, bigbluemarble.earth. It's the 101 Reasons Why I Love Nature. Anyway, another thing I wanted to share on today's show is this fantastic program I came across last week. Now, if you're in the GTA, that's the Greater Toronto area, you may see me on CTV News Toronto. And every day we try to broadcast live at some various location. I love, we call them Anwar's Adventures. I love these little stories. I love meeting new people. And we were learning about this initiative called Project Feeder Watch. It's essentially a backyard bird program, and it's been running for over 30 years with citizen scientists. So participants from across the continent, not just Canada, right across North America. And basically you volunteer to document the number and types of birds that feed in your backyard. And they would request bare minimum at least twice. I mean, ideally, if you could do it twice a week, that'd be fantastic. But just on 2 occasions, the program is 21 weeks long. So from the beginning of November until April. And this data helps determine bird trends, including population, migration, sometimes even illness among a species, and so much more. And thousands of people are doing this. They're participating. Very cool initiative. And I like to highlight some organizations that help and nurture nature. So I definitely wanted to share this. And it's a joint partnership with Bird Studies Canada and Cornell Lab of Ornithology. So if you'd like to do it, the website is birdscanada.org/feederwatch. Now, when we were there, I met Carrie from the program, but also a gentleman and his wife, Rob and Angie, and they've been doing this for 15 years. and he has personally documented 76 species of birds. He has over a dozen feeders. Really a magical little place there. And he admits he's not an expert. If there's a bird that he's not able to identify, he takes pictures, and then he'll refer to the internet. And also the program, by the way, helps you with that as well. They give you literature and where you live and sort of the typical bird species that would tend to cycle through there. But they'll help you. So I thought it was very cool. Wanted to share it, and I know there are many, many people that have bird feeders. We have 3 of our own in our backyard, and it may be something you want to do and be a part of this Project Feeder Watch, all right? So I'll also put the link on our website again in case you missed it. But let's switch gears. We have a great show guest coming up, very timely here. The reports keep coming in, whether it's from the United Nations. They submitted the 6th Global Environmental Outlook. It's a 708-page document highlighting environmental threats that are jeopardizing human health. The Canadian Pediatric Society also submitted a recent report specifically offering new guidance to emerging health issues related to climate change. They were focusing on kids, obviously, included heat sickness, reduced air quality, which means asthma concerns, and contaminated water sources. And the most recent was submitted by The Lancet, a medical journal that compiled input from doctors, climatologists, economists, and more. And I have to be honest, it paints a dire picture. So I wanted to read you an excerpt from the report. This is by Nick Watts. He's the executive director of Lancet Countdown. A child born today could live in a world that's 4 degrees warmer than in pre-industrial times, and we have no idea what that looks like from a public health perspective, but we know it is catastrophic. He added, we know that it has the potential to undermine the last 50 years of gains in public health and overwhelm the health systems we rely on. I mean, this is monumental. So much to take in. I'm a dad of 2 young kids. That is sort of the inspiration here of why I'm doing this podcast. We all have to work together, and this is very frightening. So my guest today, Dr. Kalaichandran, she'll be guiding us through a number of scenarios on how the climate crisis is making us sick. In fact, it is already happening, and that's next.
Have a question, comment, or show idea? Let us know at bigbluemarble.earth.
And the doctor is in. It is a pleasure to welcome you, Dr. Kalaichandran, to the Big Blue Marble podcast.
I appreciate that, Anwar. Thank you.
I was so glad to see and read your article that appeared in the Boston Globe highlighting the connection between climate change and our health, because it reaffirms my belief how ill-prepared we are for the changes that are occurring. And as I highlighted briefly at the start of the show, there are many, many reports now that are coming out, and the consensus is there are some real challenges when it comes to healthcare and the climate crisis. We have The Lancet. They were quite direct in what health challenges that kids born today will face. And to help buffer those impacts, it has to start in the doctor's office. They are the vanguard on how to navigate through this and will help establish the best way to respond to this impending crisis. Also, of course, the Canadian Pediatric Society recognized that with their own recent report urging health professionals to push governments to do more, especially for children. So the alarm bells are going off at the top level, which is great. But are the doctors hearing it? And that's where I wanted to start. Is this on the radar for most doctors, that being symptoms of illness related to climate change?
That's a great question. So I would say, just taking a step back for a moment, there's certainly more awareness around the environmental factors as they relate to our health, both the social environment as well as the physical environment. So by social environment, I mean the workplaces that we work in, the schools that we go to, our social support. By physical environment, I mean our neighborhoods, the air we breathe. And this is really where the climate change aspect plays a role. And what I would say is that it's been very heartening to see in the last several years that Canadian doctors especially are taking a bigger role in terms of an advocacy point of view as it relates to climate change and health. So we know that in 2017, there was a large Health Canada poll that found that 80% of Canadians believe that climate change is an issue, but only 50% believe that climate change is currently an issue as it relates to their health and well-being. So Canadian physicians have really taken that as an opportunity to raise awareness, improve education, etc., among the Canadian public. So one example of that is the Canadian Medical Association, which is led by Dr. Sandy Buckman, who has taken a large leadership role in that regard this year, as well as the Canadian Association for Physicians for the Environment, which is led by Dr. Courtney Howard, who has really emerged as a major voice in terms of raising awareness and advocating around the health risks of climate change. And exactly a year ago, we saw that the Canadian Public Health Association, the Canadian Medical Association, as well as the Canadian Association, again, as for Physicians for the Environment, came up with 7 recommendations to improve the awareness of climate change and health risks and really decrease the impact. So in summary, really, we are seeing that it is on the radar for most health professionals in general, especially doctors. And that's very heartening as we begin to move forward in terms of what the solutions might be to these impacts.
Yeah. Well, that's certainly encouraging, and I hope that'll be the trend. Any personal reflections, though, interactions with patients that you may have already had that stands out?
Definitely. So as a resident myself, I'm still in training, but there's certainly cases that I think of, patients that I've seen that have been impacted by their environment in general. So again, just making this crystal clear is it's hard to say for an individual patient that their particular illness is directly linked to a warming planet. And I would definitely caution, anyone in terms of drawing that exact link, because it's a little bit more nuanced than that. And what I mean is that, as I mentioned earlier, our health and well-being is impacted by our social and physical environment. There's absolutely no doubt about that. So we know that our genetics play a role, luck plays a role, and our environment plays a role. So taking an example of asthma, because you mentioned it earlier. So asthma is one of the most common chronic childhood diseases. It involves the abnormal inflammation of our airways, but we also need a trigger for an asthma attack. So the triggers can be stress, the triggers can be weather, all kinds of environmental triggers are out there. So climate change would certainly play a role in that regard. So an example might be a child that is playing outside and maybe becomes triggered by pollen, and that pollen maybe would not typically be in the air at that time of the year, but because of changes in our climate, we are seeing certain trends moving up in terms of earlier in the year, in terms of the prevalence of pollen as well as particulate matter, pollution, et cetera, in the air. So that's one example, and then thinking about the role of heat stroke as well. So that's when your body overheats, typically over 40 degrees Celsius. So that's usually more common in the summertime, but we are seeing that on more days in the summer than we have in the past.
Yeah, and I guess this is a scenario that will evolve over time, right? The reality is medical schools will need to modify and update the training and the curriculum so the next generation of physicians will not only be able to recognize but also respond and hopefully mitigate the health impacts of our changing climate for the public at large. But, that undoubtedly will be another stressor for our healthcare system. I mean, that is already stretched.
Definitely. So I think that that report that I mentioned earlier, that was a collaboration with the Lancet and the Canadian Medical Association, it was released in November 2018. So one of the 7 recommendations they made was that medical schools and other health profession schools, that includes nursing, that includes physiotherapy, that they increase the amount of curriculum that's focused on climate change. So in other words, increase the amount of educational hours that are devoted to the health impacts of climate change. And so what does that look like? So part of that is really to ensure that the future generation of doctors and nurses can identify illnesses that are linked to climate change. So for example, malaria. So we don't typically see malaria in Canada unless it's from a returned traveler, but certainly in the next, possibly in the next decade, we may see changes in our climate that foster the types of mosquitoes that typically do not live in Canada. We've seen the same sort of trend with Lyme disease. So we never used to see Lyme disease in Ontario because the ticks that typically carry Lyme disease, they found Canadian climates to be not hospitable. But over time, as we've been dealing with a warming planet, we've certainly seen a shift in that regard. So more people now are aware of Lyme disease, and we're going to have to increase the amount of awareness and education and competencies around some of these diseases that we typically don't see here. So that's one aspect in terms of the curriculum side of things.
So let's break down some of this then. The common denominator, by and large, are the rising temperatures. And if you look at some of the forecast model projections that suggest for our summer here in Ontario, Canada, we typically get 12 to 15 days that are 30 degrees or higher. That's about 87 Fahrenheit. But it's projected to be more like 16 to 40 days. In fact, some models suggest in 80 years, the average summer day will be 31.3 degrees. And it's already a fact that more people die in the summer with extreme heat than of the brutal cold of winter.
Exactly. And we know Health Canada had this report last year where they looked at the heat wave in July of 2018 in Quebec, and they determined that about 90 people died as a direct result of that heat wave that happened. So you're absolutely right. This is a very real thing that we're dealing with, and it's appropriate that there are concerns and alarms and anxieties around that. And so the next step is really trying to figure out what we can do about it.
Well, it's interesting, too, what was once generally considered a luxury for the longest time, that being air conditioning, is actually now a necessity. And a strategy will have to be laid out on how to keep people cool to avoid heat stress. It will need to focus especially on the most vulnerable, including those living in public housing, to kids in schools, and also even employers. They will need to address it. As indicated in the Lancet report, in 2018, almost 134 billion potential work hours were lost due to extreme heat in the world. I know that's a completely different issue, but certainly worth mentioning. Let's push forward now, though, because you also highlighted a health concern between rising temperatures and seafood.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there are certain types of algae that bloom in warmer temperatures. So it's really interesting when we think about the environmental impacts and the downstream impact on our health. So there's a type of algae that effectively creates something called domoic acid. And it's typically seen in more tropical oceans, but we're now seeing it in traditionally cooler oceans now in the Atlantic and the Pacific. So there was a study that came out. It was a modeling study. So they did some mathematical modeling to estimate the impact. And so they looked at the ocean conditions in the Northeast Pacific and found that that if climate change continued the way that it was expected to continue, that there would be an increased risk of this domoic acid buildup, which unfortunately these fish eat this algae, and so they build up this acid as well, and so that gets translated to our plate effectively. So the one caution here is that it was a modeling study. This isn't, they didn't go and collect a bunch of samples of fish and do assessments that way, but it is still significant in the sense that it does show, again, just another way that our oceans and the food that we eat will also be impacted by warming waters.
This has been a major concern in particular for shellfish. Some research is suggesting that the higher the toxin levels, the longer it takes for some species to flush it out, and that may be as long as a year after warm ocean conditions have subsided, so that is huge. And this hits close to home too. Although there are different types of algae growth, this past summer was in fact one of the most severe and toxic blooms in Lake Erie. It was over 1,800 square kilometers by the end of August. And it prompted, of course, numerous water warnings and beach closings. But for our friends listening right now, if you want to see that, I've posted a satellite image, courtesy of NASA, on our website in this episode's show notes, bigbluemarble.earth. And you'll just see this monster blob of green. And to be clear here, in some instances, especially for lakes, it's fueled by fertilizer runoff, generally speaking, from farm fields. It's the phosphorus. And there are certainly efforts underway now for the agricultural industry to reduce the use of it. But the connection with climate change is that you get more frequent and intense storms, and that causes flooding and then runoff, and it pushes it all into the water. And scientists also are predicting, as well with the frequency and intensity of hurricanes, that ocean algae blooms will be moving to new locations. Now, do we know how dangerous this is?
So domoic acid is a neurotoxin, so it does have an impact on brain health. We don't know exactly what the impact might be on, for example, fetal brains. So developing brains if women a pregnant woman was to eat a fish, but for someone that isn't pregnant, just someone that's just consuming a type of fish that may happen to have this acid buildup, they could have an impact from that. So we know a lot about mercury, for example. So it would be similar in that regard. It would be another example of an environmental issue that is really transmitted through the fish that we eat.
So clearly this would be something that would now likely have to be included into the precautions list for pregnant women.
Absolutely. And I think that right now, physicians that do specialize in counseling pregnant women and seeing pregnant women, so obstetricians, some family doctors, there is counseling that is, has been going on for years in terms of food. So the standard right now is actually cautioning about the amount of fish a pregnant woman is to eat per year. We say no raw fish, no unpasteurized cheeses, that kind of thing is what's already been given in terms of counseling. And so the fish part was traditionally linked to the concern about mercury. So certainly now, as we're seeing the impact of climate change, so whether it's domoic acid or other things, there will need to be that additional layer of counseling for all patients, not just pregnant women, in terms of, again, educating patients about the impacts of climate change and ways to offset some of that impact where possible.
But this was not the only red flag for maternal health. You also referenced other studies, and all of them are alarming.
Yeah, so there's a few interesting studies that have looked at the impact of climate change on pregnant women. So in 2017, there was a review that looked at 28 studies and found that there were significant risks between extremes of temperature and premature birth, as well as birth weight and stillbirth. So effectively, what they found was that, again, these extremes in temperature, so it wasn't necessarily very high temperatures, it was more that sort of range, was linked to premature birth, low birth weight, and stillbirth. And then just 2 weeks ago, there was a study that came out of China that found a significant link between air pollution and the risk of miscarriage. So that was published in the journal Nature Sustainability. So certainly there's been a lot more interest in looking at these associations. Now, again, any study that is a study of studies, which means it's a large review, there are limitations because you're reviewing a lot of different studies that measure things in different ways. So it's not perfect, but it does certainly raise the alarm again to look at what the various impacts are and what the impacts could be on pregnant women. Taking even Zika, for example. So Zika is spread by a specific type of mosquito that's found in specific areas of the world. And that mosquito lives in those areas because of the climate and the weather. So as the climate changes, you'll see changes in where some of these vectors or insects decide to live. So again, it should be on everybody's radar.
Yeah, and if we could just circle back just for a moment regarding that study out of China, it was quite extensive. It involved over 250,000 pregnant women over 8 years. And as you pointed out, researchers have admitted there are still a lot of unknowns, but it is one of the first studies of its kind to link particle pollution and impacts on pregnancies. So it's very important. I'm curious, though, do these things that we've been highlighting ignite a new conversation among the next generation of primary care practitioners? Because it really is a whole new set of healthcare challenges.
So I think that's a really good point. I think that what's been really, really interesting in the last several years in medical schools across Canada is that medical schools are quite open now in terms of the range of applicants they accept. And the reason that this is important is that there are a lot of physicians that go into medicine specifically because they want to advocate for patients and they have an interest in the social determinants of health. They have an interest in the link between environment and health. So you see pockets of these advocacy groups that are really spreading, which is really wonderful. So, every physician has their sort of niche and their interest, but certainly there is a growing number in my view. I think there is a growing number of physicians, both in terms of newer generation physicians and people that have been practicing for years, who are interested in this advocacy aspect. And it really is about, how do we better engage our patients around these issues? How do we better engage our local politicians? Physicians are a pretty large lobby group, so they do wield a lot of power, and with that power comes responsibility. So it's about, how do you engage as a group in a way that will, push for change and hopefully help mitigate some of the impact of these issues. And I think related to that, and something we haven't really touched on so far in our conversation, is who are the groups that are primarily impacted by climate change. So all of us are impacted, but unfortunately, globally, as well as right here in Canada, we see groups that are more disproportionately affected. We see Indigenous groups in the north that are losing their livelihood in terms of traditional hunting, the times of the year that they can hunt. We see what are called climate refugees in different parts of the world, people that have to leave, different areas in their own countries because of rising waters. We even see that in Quebec, in Hudson, Quebec, that was an issue too. So we're seeing that the impact of climate change, unfortunately, is disproportionately affecting people that, may not have access to the resources to help mitigate those impacts. And so that really gets into, again, the advocacy part of things, and then the role that doctors play in that.
Yeah. Well, let's end off with perhaps the most underrated activity known to man, and that is sleep. Oh, to get a good night's sleep. I mean, it's the core of our existence. Your body needs rest because it provides that vital recharge to enable us to fight illness.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And this is a topic that's very close to my heart. I wrote an article about sleep just a few months ago. So sleep is one of the most underrated things. It's really a domino effect. If we're sleep deprived, we're more likely to get into car accidents. We're more likely to feel depressed. We're more likely to choose unhealthy foods because our bodies crave sugar and salt and that sort of thing. So sleep is one of those things where if you can optimize your sleep, you are already doing yourself a huge favor in terms of your own health and well-being. So what's interesting, though, in the last couple of years is there was a study that was published in 2017. It was the largest study of its kind that actually took almost 770,000 U.S. survey respondents, and surveyed them from 2002 to 2011, and looked at things like nighttime temperature data, as well as self-reported nights of insufficient sleep. So they found that the largest impact was during the summer. So when the temperatures were higher, they found that people reported more insufficient sleep. And this was more common in lower income as well as elderly respondents. So again, this was the first large study of its kind, and it was self-reported data. So there's lots of limitations of self-report because people don't often remember how well they sleep or not. But again, it does point to a disturbing trend. And, and there are certain things that all of us can do to improve our sleep. There's many things. One of the things that we recommend is really making sure that the temperature is optimized. So believe it or not, we actually get better quality sleep when the temperature is a little bit lower. So that does explain why some people like to sleep with the windows open. But, there is an optimum temperature that allows us to get to sleep faster and to stay asleep for a longer period of time. And we all have had experiences where the air conditioning doesn't work, or we're traveling and it's really hot and it's really, really hard to get to sleep. Certainly that is an issue that we will begin to see with rising temperatures.
Well, you won't get an argument out of me. I'm at that stage now. I like a cool room in January, let alone July. But this has been a real eye-opener, so thanks for that.
Thank you so much for having me, Anwar, and for doing this podcast. It's excellent, so keep it up.
My guest has been Dr. Amitha Kalaichandran. To see her full article and more, log online to dramitha.com. Let's travel the world now as we look at other headlines from our changing planet with the Blue Files. The benefits of connecting with nature have long been documented, but Just how many minutes are required? Well, according to researchers from the University of Exeter, it's 120. They collected data from 20,000 people across England in one of the world's largest studies on people and their interactions with nature to see how much time was optimal for spending in nature to experience health benefits. They noted if you spend less than 2 hours, it did not garner any health benefits. Dr. Matt White, the leader of the study, says the majority of nature visits took place within just a couple of kilometers of home, so even visiting local urban green spaces seemed to be a good thing. And 2 hours a week is hopefully a realistic target for many people, especially given that it can be spread over an entire week to get the benefit. The study on nature therapy also showed that it helped both men and women, and age, income, occupation, and health status had no impact on the results. If extreme heat, severe storms, and a potential food crisis doesn't get climate crisis deniers' attention, maybe their toilet will. A new United Nations report says that rising sea levels could render as many as 60 million toilets inoperable in the United States. About 1 in 5 American households rely on septic systems to handle their toilet waste, according to the Environmental Protection Agency. These systems work by draining flush toilets into an underground tank where bacteria breaks it down into water and solid sludge. That water then moves through an outflow tube into a drainage field. However, as sea levels rise, those drainage fields are becoming saturated, preventing them from absorbing liquid from septic tanks. In addition, erosion removes the necessary soft earth to filter out pollutants, resulting also in public health hazards and groundwater contamination. Florida is just one state that is especially vulnerable. Its sea level has risen in some areas by as much as 8 inches or 20 centimeters since 1950. 3 cows that were swept out to sea after Hurricane Dorian hit their home on Cedar Island in North Carolina have been found alive, 4 months later, now grazing happily on another barrier island. Dorian was the second strongest Atlantic hurricane on record, with wind gusts reaching over 300 kilometers an hour. Park rangers believe the storm surge swept the wildlife out to sea, and these cows then swam about 6 kilometers to reach North Carolina's Outer Banks. The cows, which appear to be in good health, are thought to be a part of a group of 20 wild cattle that were known on Cedar Island as sea cows. They roamed wild and free on a privately owned ranch. Officials now say they are planning to capture the wild cattle and return them to their original home. And that's this edition of the Blue Files. Well, look at that. We started with fish and we end with sea cows. My job is done, ladies and gentlemen. A big thank you for your support and listening in today. I want to say a quick shout out to Cindy. She reached out on Instagram and she now reposts all the Big Blue Marble updates that I send out. Thank you for that, Cindy. I really appreciate it. That's how podcasts grow, people sharing it. So I appreciate everybody reposting. I really do. It makes my day, to be quite honest, because it tells me that you're liking the show. Of course, that doesn't mean I only want to hear good stuff. I appreciate all of your feedback, good or bad. If you have suggestions, things you'd like to see more of or less of, connect with me on our website at bigbluemarble.earth. You can also follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Anwar Knight. That's ANWAR, Knight with a K. On Facebook, Anwar Knight TV. Please subscribe to the podcast. Very important. Little link right on the player. And that way you'll be one of the first to know when I drop a new episode. We do that every 2 weeks. Be sure to subscribe to the newsletter as well. I'm just starting to compile that. We'll be sending out our first edition in the coming weeks. We'll show you some behind-the-scenes stuff, upcoming episodes, also some eco tips and things like that. But for now, that wraps up another show. Thanks so much for listening. I'm Anwar Knight, wishing you a great day here on the Big Blue Marble.
That was another great show, Daddy.